Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of interesting family-friendly books and stories, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about the history of basketball. Yes, we've tackled the history of baseball. We've tackled the New York Mets. Oh my goodness, when I made that episode, that was before the season started. We're here in this episode in 2026, the summer of 2026. What a debacle of a year for the New York Mets, but I digress. We also did a history of tennis. So now we're tackling baseball. And you know what? We're going to walk through everything. Everything you need to know about basketball, whether you know nothing about basketball or you know plenty, right? The basics. You got to know about the history and what has occurred. It is one of the biggest sports right next to baseball and basketball, and yes, hockey, in the United States. And it's a worldwide sport. It went from just being in the United States, and over the last 40 years, it's now truly a worldwide phenomenon. And it all started with James Naismith. He was born in 1861 in Ontario, Canada. His parents were Scottish immigrants, but both of his parents passed away from typhoid fever when he was still a child. So he and his siblings were raised by an uncle and an aunt. And typical childhood, he loved being outside. He ended up, he left high school for several years. He worked on his family farm before eventually returning to complete his education. But one childhood game became especially important to his future. It was called Duck on a Rock. In the game, one player places a stone, called a duck, on top of a larger rock. Other players would throw stones at it, trying to knock it down. Naismith noticed, instead of throwing it directly and really hard horizontally at it, instead of trying to do that to get the rock down, if you gave it a nice, high, soft arc, it would drop, and it would be more effective getting that stone off of that big rock. Years later, he said, in terms of his kind of inspiration, he went back to that childhood experience. And that inspired that arching shot used in basketball. He attended McGill University in Montreal, where he was not simply a student. He was a good athlete, and he competed in football, lacrosse, rugby, gymnastics, and track and field. And football during this time was pretty violent. And he was really credited not only for inventing this new game, but being safe. That was part of what he ultimately did. He wanted to create a game that you could be played inside that could be safe. And he's actually also credited for using padding to protect your ears while playing football. Athletics wasn't his whole life. He studied theology, and originally he wanted to be a Presbyterian minister. But he believed, that being active and being religious could work together. So rather viewing sports as a distraction, he really did believe that they could be part in one of the same, and that was what led him to the YMCA movement. In 1890, he left Canada to attend the International YMCA Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's now known as Springfield College. The YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, it wasn't just merely a place with exercise equipment. It trained physical education instructors who were then sent throughout the United States and around the world. My gym teacher, I remember he went to Springfield College. The legacy is still there. So many phys ed teachers came out of Springfield, and he was one of them. And this whole YMCA network is one of the reasons that basketball grew immediately so quickly. Because, hey, when I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, it seemed like you played basketball, you played in the YMCA leagues. That was a foundational part of basketball. It wasn't town leagues. It was set up through your churches very often. And that was my experience. So Naismith's supervisor at Springfield was Luther Gulick. He was an important figure in the development of American physical education. And during the winter of 1891, his program had a problem. They were becoming difficult to control. Who am I talking about? The kids, the students. Outdoor football and baseball were impractical, obviously, during the New England winters, right? There was nothing to do inside. So, yeah, there was exercises you could do, gymnastics, drills, but there was no game. So teachers tried modifying football, soccer, lacrosse for indoor use, but it didn't work. There was too many injuries. It was too rough. There was equipment. It just didn't make sense. So Gulick gave Naismith the assignment to make a new game that kids could be safe, right? And would enjoy. As the story goes, he had 2 weeks to come up with a game. It needed to be played indoors, obviously. It needed to provide some great exercise. It couldn't have a lot of equipment. And it had to involve skill rather than just strength. It had to be less violent than football. He initially worried, Naismith, that every possible game had already been invented. Then he began breaking existing sports down into their basic features, right? This is what he was thinking of. Games usually involve some kind of ball. It was either large or soft, and certainly it was going to be safer inside if it was smaller and not hard, right? Tackling occurred when players ran carrying the ball, so Naismith decided that a player would not be allowed to run with the ball. If a goal were placed on the floor, defenders would gather around it and collisions were inevitably would follow. Therefore, the goal should be raised above the player's head. That was the breakthrough. Think about it. We take this so much for granted, but you really needed to think outside the box. So he asked the school's building superintendent, his name was Pop Stebbins, for 2 boxes. Stebbins reportedly couldn't find the boxes, so he came up with 2 peach baskets instead. The baskets were attached to the railing of the gymnasium's elevated running track. So many of those old schools, and you'll still see it in some universities, big gym inside. I remembered visiting so many with my daughter, and I would see them, and they're really, really nice. More gymnasiums should have it, but it's an elevated oval track going around the top of the gymnasium. And in this case, what he did was he put those peach baskets along or attached it to the railing that was at the bottom of this elevated track. Put one on one side of the gym and the other directly across on the other side of the gym. And it just so happened, how far off the ground was that railing? 10 feet. Yes, and that still stands today. That's the regulation size of a basketball hoop off the ground. And it wasn't obviously done intentionally. It was like this was the only convenient place to put these peach baskets. And at first, yes, they would run up and down the court, and the object was to get the ball into the peach basket. And initially, there was no hole at the bottom of the peach basket. And the custodian needed to get up on a ladder every time it went in and bring it back down. Eventually, this wasn't practical, and he poked a hole right there at the bottom of the peach basket so the ball would come down each time it went in. So Naismith wrote down 13 rules and had them typed and posted on a bulletin board. The first recognized game was played in December 1891 with 18 students, 9 on each team because 18 students happened to be the number that were there that day. Nine wasn't Naismith's permanently selected ideal number. He simply divided the available class in half. Each team had 3 forwards, 3 centers, and 3 guards. They played with the soccer ball because, right, there was no specific manufactured ball, right? At that point, this is the only ball that was available. And the game consisted of 2 15-minute halves with a 5-minute break. There was no dribbling. A player could bat the ball with one or both of his hands, but he could not punch it. A player catching the ball while running was expected to stop. The ball advanced primarily through passing. Body contact was prohibited, but the first game was reportedly still rough. The students tackled, shoved, and struck one another until they understood how the new rules were supposed to work. One student was reportedly knocked unconscious, another suffered a shoulder injury, and several fouls were called. Interesting, right? Fouls, here we are. Right from the beginning, there were fouls. Only one basket was scored during that first game. William Chase made it from approximately 25 feet away, and his team won 1-0. The first basketball game in history was obviously not a high-scoring affair, and his students actually suggested calling the name right from the beginning Naismith Ball. But he rejected the idea. Because the game was played with a basket, he called it basketball, and it was originally 2 words. And again, I have to mention this, Springfield College is where it all began. And yes, as a side note, a shout out to Tony Kutch. He was not only my gym teacher in elementary school, he was my cross-country coach and track and field coach all through high school. He meant so much to me in terms of my development, not only as an athlete, but as a young man, and I'll be forever indebted to him. I miss you, Tony. I missed you, Mr. Kutch. Rest in peace. So it spread. And like I said before, it wasn't by accident. The YMCA instructors came from all over the country, and Naismith taught him how to play the game. The rules were printed in the Springfield school newspaper, The Triangle, in January 1892. And yes, copies traveled throughout the whole YMCA network. Soon it wasn't just the YMCA, it was colleges, it was schools, it was church groups, like I said, and really throughout the world it spread. And it's funny, you may be thinking, he didn't patent the game at all. And he did not become wealthy from inventing it at all. And fun fact, although he wouldn't say it's fun, he moved to the University of Kansas and he coached the school's early teams. But he wasn't that successful. He finished his career with a losing record. But you think of college basketball, and yes, you do think of Kansas. His influence was huge. One of the players he first coached was Forrest Fogg Allen, and he became a legendary Kansas coach later on. And yes, he coached future coaching giants Adolph Rupp and Dean Smith. Rupp built Kentucky into a national power, and yes, Dean Smith became a legendary coach at North Carolina, and yes, he coached Michael Jordan. So it's very interesting how the path all started in so many ways from James Naismith. Thankfully, he lived long enough to see the game become an Olympic sport in 1936 at the Berlin Games. And listen to this, it wasn't inside, it was actually outside on clay and sand courts. The rain turned the championship into a muddy mess. The United States beat Canada 19-8 for the gold medal. Imagine that. James Naismith passed away in 1939, the same year that the first NCAA men's basketball tournament was held. So as the game progressed, the earliest balls had laces, and they definitely didn't bounce very well. They were very unexpected in terms of, talk about early dribbling. That developed gradually. Players first bounced the ball as a type of pass to themselves. Early rules sometimes permitted only one bounce or did not allow a player to shoot after dribbling. Backboards were introduced partly because spectators in balconies could interfere with shots near the basket. Think of that. Fans reportedly reached towards the ball, swatted it away, or attempted to guide it towards the basket. The backboard began, like I said, as protection from audience interference. Only later did players realize, hey, we could actually use this to develop a bank shot. Some early courts were surrounded by wire mesh or cages to prevent the ball from leaving the play area. Are you kidding me? The cages kept the game moving, but they were also obviously dangerous. Players were pushed into the wire fencing, and, it was just a mess. The clean wooden court, the breakaway rim, the glass backboard, the orange ball, and the painted lines all developed over many years. So what about the early leagues? What about the great teams? What about the great players early on? Well, professional basketball did exist long before the NBA. The early leagues were not stable at all. The first organization was called the National Basketball League, and it operated from 1898 to 1904. And it was followed by other short-term leagues and traveling teams during the 1920s. Listen to this. The original Celtics, they were based in New York, and they were unrelated to today's Boston Celtics. They became one of the country's greatest traveling teams throughout the country. Black teams, such as the New York Renaissance, known as the Wrens, and the Harlem Globetrotters. Yes, they drew large crowds despite being excluded from many white leagues. Basketball was no different than baseball. The American Basketball League began in 1925, and another National Basketball League, or NBL, formed in 1937. The early professional big-time teams were the Fort Wayne Zollner Pistons, the Rochester Royals, the Syracuse Nationals, the Minneapolis Lakers. Yes. The Basketball Association of America, or BAA, began playing in 1946, and it placed teams in major arenas in cities such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. In 1949, the BAA absorbed several NBL teams and adopted the name National Basketball Association. The NBA counts the BAA's first season of 1946-47 as the beginning of its official history. The early dominant star was George Mikan of the Minneapolis Lakers. They won 5 championships in 6 seasons across the BAA and the NBA between 1949 and 1954. The other early stars were Bob Davies of the Rochester Royals, Dolph Schayes of the Syracuse Nationals, Bob Pettit of the St. Louis Hawks, and yes, you know basketball, you've heard of him, Bob Cousy of the Boston Celtics. Boston's dynasty began when this coach by the name of Red Auerbach, the famous coach with that cigar always in his mouth, the dynasty began when he added Bill Russell to the team that already included Bob Cousy and rookie Tommy Heinsohn. The Celtics became the dominant power in the NBA. They won their first championship in 1957, and they captured, listen to this, really has not been done since then till today in any sport. They won 11 championship titles in 13 seasons right through 1969, including 8 straight from 1959 through 1966. Russell was dominant with his rebounding, with his defense, shot blocking, and definitely big-time leadership, while Cousy, Heinsohn, and Sam Jones, Casey Jones, and John Havlicek provided a lot of the other support and depth. Talk about so much of the Boston Celtics. If you're talking about the early history of the NBA, you have to talk about them. Russell won all 11 of those championships as a player, serving first as a player coach for the final 2 and becoming the first black head coach to win a championship in any major American professional league. Altogether, the Celtics have won 18 championships, 11 during the Russell dynasty, 2 more during the 1970s, 3 with Larry Bird in the 1980s, 1 in 2008, and they're 18th in 2024. If you're talking baseball and Yankees and being dominant, you're talking basketball with the Celtics. Now, if there's one sport that is synonymous with the growth of the game being at the professional level and the amateur level, it's basketball. The college game grew just as much, and it was really only up until Larry Bird and Magic Johnson came into the league in the early 1980s that, listen, everyone played for 4 years in college, and you knew the players in college. Now, today, if you're a good player, you leave college right after your freshman year. But in terms of the history, it started in the early 1900s. The first major postseason tournament, it wasn't the NCAA tournament. It was the opposite. It was the National Invitation Tournament called the NIT. The NIT is still out there, played in Madison Square Garden, but it's the second tier of tournaments. As a matter of fact, I think there's 3 or 4 now. So the NIT was the premier tournament. The first NIT champion was Temple University. 1 year later, in 1939, the NCAA held its first national tournament, and it invited only 8 teams. Oregon beat Ohio State, and they became the first NCAA champion. The NCAA tournament now, slowly grew in importance, and by the late 40s, schools increasingly viewed the NCAA championship as the ultimate prize, not the NIT. Shout out to Holy Cross, my son's college. Yes, they were early and good at college basketball. Why? Because Bob Cousy went there. This little college, this Jesuit college up in Worcester, Massachusetts, it was a powerhouse. And yes, all those years ago, 1947, it actually won the NCAA champion. Little Holy Cross. As the sport went on into the 60s, the legendary coach was John Wooden at UCLA. It was Adolph Rupp, as I mentioned before, at Kentucky. Yes, there was Dean Smith in North Carolina, but there was also Bob Knight at Indiana, Mike Krzyzewski at Duke, and yes, Jim Calhoun at Connecticut, Roy Williams at Kansas. So, listen to this. Originally, it expanded from 8 teams to 16 teams in 1951. Then it went to 32 teams in 1975. Then 64 teams in 1985. And today, there's 68 teams. It is the iconic event in March throughout the country. They call it March Madness. The Final Four. People fill out brackets and compete in their local offices, in their neighborhoods. It truly is an American tradition at this point. Cinderella stories, championship moments. It's March Madness. Now, getting back to the professional leagues, after the dominance of Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics, as you went through the years, clearly you have to talk about Wilt Chamberlain. The record is still out there today. He scored 100 points in one game, and he averaged more than 50 points for an entire season. Players have their best individual game if they score 50 points for one game. After that, you had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the 80s. I've mentioned these two before. They elevated the game. Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. Then, of course, you had the rival of Michael Jordan. As you go into the 90s, the 2000s, you had Kobe Bryant of the Lakers. You had Tim Duncan of the Spurs. And, of course, the king, LeBron James of the Cavaliers, and Steph Curry of the Warriors. Today, you have so many dominant, great players. You have so many teams that are fantastic. But if you point to the big teams, you have to talk about the Los Angeles Lakers in addition to the Celtics through the 80s and the 90s. Then you had Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. And, of course, hey, I cannot go without saying the New York Knicks, who here in the release of this podcast in the summer of 2026, the New York Knicks actually won their first championship. The one team that all New Yorkers can get behind, because in baseball you have both the Mets and the Yankees. Hey, the last time we had won an NBA championship was 1973 with Walt Frazier and Willis Reed, Earl Monroe, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, and now for a whole nother generation, you will forever talk about Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns and, yes, OG Anunoby. So before we wrap up the podcast, because we can certainly dive into so many of these topics and they're all deserving of future episodes. Hey, if you're talking about basketball in the history, you have to talk about the ABA and how it changed everything. The NBA, frankly, was floundering as we were going into the 70s. Yes, the Celtics had all this success, but the rest of the league, they weren't selling out games. They were in small little gymnasiums. I mean, I can distinctly remember in the Teaneck Armory, the early New Jersey Nets. They were an ABA team, but this was like a little high school auditorium. It was that small. The NBA was not on TV. When it was on TV, it was at times people were watching it, and the championship right up and through the early 80s with Magic and Bird arriving was tape delayed. This was the state of the affair. In 67, the American Basketball Association arrived, and they, like I said, changed everything. It went from a stale game where there were bounce passes, no one was dunking it, they were passing it all over the place, and there wasn't a lot of action. They went from an orange ball to a red, white, and blue ball. You had players like Dr. J, Julius Erving, dunking the ball. For so long in colleges, you couldn't even dunk the ball. You had the tallest person in the world, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was known as Lou Alcindor back at UCLA, and he, like I said, he couldn't dunk the ball. So here was this new league, and it was exciting. I distinctly remember Dr. J being on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and everyone was talking about him. We're talking now in the early, let's say mid-70s, 75, 76, and wow, who is this guy? Look at what he could do. And yes, they also developed a three-point shot. The fans loved it. So in 1976, 4 ABA teams ended up joining the NBA. And it was really from here that the NBA ended up taking off. It still took some time, but 10 years later, with the arrival of Michael Jordan, and the game went to the stratosphere. Mostly because of Michael Jordan and this company called Nike, who ended up having a shoe named after him. Yes, it became more than a sport. It shaped fashion. The sneakers became collectibles. Players' jersey became everyday clothing, and hip-hop culture and basketball influenced one another for decades. You had movies like Hoosiers, Space Jam, He Got Game. It brought basketball to new audiences, video games, fantasy leagues. And yes, it's a game where you don't have to speak the same language. You know the game. Everyone knows it. To the point where today, up to 1/4, 25% of the professional players in the NBA are actually outside the United States. So, if it's not the United States, it's Europe, it's Asia, especially China, it's Australia, it's Africa. Players are playing this wonderful game, and to think it all began because one gym teacher was looking for another game to play inside. Friends, thanks for taking this journey with me, learning all about the history of basketball. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on Facebook. We are on X. We are on YouTube. We are on Spotify. Hey, subscribe, listen. Always appreciate the feedback. And yes, very soon, we will be on patreon.com where you can support the podcast. Appreciate it. And friends, until next time, have fun and keep learning.